Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar for mental health professionals, the practice of cultural humility, addressing privilege, stereotypes, biases, and microaggression in the therapeutic context. My name is Sasha Sicard, and I am the Education and Membership Manager here at ADAA. Welcome. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's webinar. We've taken a screenshot of an example of the attendee interface. You should see something that looks like this on your own computer desktop in the upper right corner. You should have joined the presentation listening to your computer's audio by default. If you would prefer to join over the phone, just select phone call in the audio panel and the dial-in information will be displayed. Please note this webinar is being recorded and will be available as an on-demand webinar within 24 hours. All attendees should ensure they remain muted for the entire presentation to avoid background noise and distractions. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions at any time of the presentation by typing your questions into the chat box of the control panel. You may send your questions at any time. We will collect these and address them during Q&A sessions throughout the presentation. For those who purchase CE or CME credit for this webinar, you'll receive an email with a link shortly after the completion of this webinar. This link will include the webinar survey and post-test questions required to receive your certificate. Please reach out to webinars@adaa.org if you do not receive this link. I would like to now introduce Drs. Hong Nguyen and Elizabeth Sauber. Dr. Nguyen has served on a number of diversity and multicultural committees in both the Department of Veteran Affairs and university settings, including the National VA Multicultural Diversity Training Committee, where she helped develop diversity training curriculum. Her interest in issues involving diversity, equity, and the inclusion is prominent in her clinical practice. She is currently a staff psychologist at the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System, where she provides culturally informed, evidence-based care to veterans in the trauma recovery services. Dr. Sauber received her degree from the University of Maryland's Counseling Psychology program. She completed her internship and fellowship at the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System, where she now works as a staff psychologist in trauma recovery and services. As a researcher and clinician, her work has focused on the intersections of trauma, grief, loss, and identity. She is especially passionate about integrating social justice and advocacy across all her roles as a psychologist. Thank you both for joining us. There will now be a brief moment of silence while I pass the presenter roles over to them.
Thank you, Sasha, for such a wonderful introduction. So I wanted to start our talk by sharing some things about myself. My experience as a psychologist, a first-generation immigrant, a Vietnamese American cisgender woman, has shaped my worldview and my practice of cultural humility, and thus it has also shaped my our talk today. And so I'm going to also introduce Dr. Sauber and have her introduce herself.
Dr. Sauber, I think we're muted.
It feels like it would not be a webinar without some kind of problems with muting, so thank you. I think similarly, something that is an important part about how I hold a stance as a psychologist is to be thinking about what context am I coming from and how is that showing up in the systems I work in, the clients I work with, and in our relationships. And so I would say it's important to name that I identify as a white, cis, Jewish, queer woman. And those things really inform where I sit and how I will be talking about things today.
Thank you, Dr. Sauber. So today we'll be discussing the practice of cultural humility, addressing privilege, stereotypes, biases, and microaggressions in the therapeutic context. We'll begin by an introduction to cultural humility. Then we'll discuss privilege and oppression, microaggressions, and end with clinical applications. So a concept analysis by Ferranda and colleagues led to the following model of cultural humility. Cultural humility is an interpersonal stance that one takes in a diverse and multicultural world where power imbalance exists. Cultural humility includes being open, self-awareness, self-reflection and critique, and being egoless and engaging in supportive interaction. And engaging in cultural humility can lead to a lifelong process of learning, mutual empowerment, mutual benefit, partnership, respect, and providing the optimal care. Specifically, cultural humility attributes includes openness. This is possessing a willing attitude to explore new ideas. In terms of self-awareness, being aware of your strengths, limitations, values, beliefs, behavior, and appearance to others. In terms of self-reflection and critique, this is a continual reflection and refinement of one's thoughts, feelings, and actions. And egoless alludes to being humble, down to earth, approaching others as equals, and when interacting with others, there's a lack of superiority. And last, supportive interaction. These are interactions that lead to a positive human exchanges. So in psychology, we are very familiar with the term cultural competence. So what's the difference between cultural humility and cultural competence? Competence means having the necessary ability, knowledge, or skill to do something successfully. So once you've reached it, you are set. In contrast, cultural humility is an interpersonal stance. This stance includes self-reflection and self-critique, knowing what you don't know, and it's a continual quest for knowledge, growth, and learning. So what do we know about cultural humility and therapeutic outcomes? Hook and al did a series of studies showing that cultural humility does impact therapeutic outcome. So their study 1 and 2 showed that cultural humility was significantly associated with stronger working alliance. In their third study, they showed that the client's perceptions of their therapist's cultural humility significantly predicted working alliance. And this result was shown over and above the client's perceptions of the therapist's cultural competence. And so cultural humility impacted working alliance over and above cultural competence. In study 4, they showed that cultural humility predicted treatment improvement through working alliance. And so just takeaway message is that cultural humility was associated with stronger working alliance, and this predicted greater treatment improvement. All right, Dr. Sauber.
So if cultural humility is our frame, this relational stance that we're saying is important to be responsive, just psychologists, I think the question becomes, why is it important? Why do we need this, and why is it an essential part of what it means to be a mental health practitioner? And our assumption is that we all believe here that the reason that's needed is because of the existence of systems of oppression and privilege. And so we're wanting to make sure everyone's on the same page about what that means, so that we all understand why we're focusing so much on this idea of cultural humility. So do you mind going to the next slide, Hong?
Mm-hmm.
So when we say oppression, what we mean or what we're talking about is the systemic and pervasive nature of inequality. And that inequality exists both institutionally and within ourselves as individuals. And we'll talk about what that actually looks like in maybe language we're used to: sexism, racism, classism, cissexism. Though the idea is that all oppression kind of has these unique processes that are or these shared processes that are happening. We see force occurring, meaning like the imposition of roles, of labels, of living conditions that are painful, that detract from a group's well-being. The process of deprivation, meaning not allowing access to certain conditions of life. So things like laws that allow employers to discriminate based on identity or deny healthcare access. And then also covert or overt policies and systems. So we're seeing that with immigration policy, for example, with the current administration, or historically through differential sentencing around specific substances that target Black and brown folks differently than white folks. And if you go to the next slide, Hong, one way to think about oppression and what that kind of looks like is to think about it as the combination of both discrimination and based on identity. And that includes not just prejudice, which is any kind of internally held bias that we all have that's not necessarily conscious, but also power. And when we talk about power, we're saying here the capacity to change or wield influence over others. And this distinction is particularly important because it means that discrimination manifests itself not just individually or interpersonally, but also in our cultural norms, in our ideology, in our political systems, in the media, and then internalized within us as individuals, including those who hold marginalized identities, because we're all been socialized into the same processes. And I'll add that because of this power, you'll hear people talk about reverse isms like reverse racism or reverse sexism, and those things aren't a thing. And that's because they don't have weight. They don't have power or the dominant story that's being told behind them. So just as an example, I used to teach a psychology of gender class, and in it we talked about this, and I would show, before even like outlining why this isn't a thing, what power is, I would show this video by BuzzFeed, problematic potentially in itself, but was a really useful visual tool where it would compare the way that women are treated in advertisements and men, and it would show like men reenacting these famous commercials where women are being sexualized. And throughout the video, the whole class is laughing as they're seeing men pose in this way. And I think that laughing is a perfect example of how reverse sexism, for example, isn't a thing, because seeing images of men in this way is funny because it's not a part of the dominant narrative. And so it doesn't have the same power, it doesn't have the same hurt behind it that we're talking about when we're talking about systems of oppression. Next. So one way to think about this to help start practicing conceptualizing oppression is something that shows up individually with our clients or people we work with or research participants, but also across these systems or levels, is to think about it in terms of the 4 I's of oppression: interpersonal, institutional, ideological, and internalized. And we are all human beings who've been socialized into these same systems of oppression. And so all of us as people participate in these things all the time. And as psychologists, we further, or as mental health practitioners generally, we've further been granted cultural power in our roles. So it means not only are we enactors of oppression as regular live selves, but also in our professional capacity. And so I think it's important to remind ourselves the way that that happens in our job. So, you know, if you think about the interpersonal level, for example, this is what we most commonly think about when we think about oppression. It comes out in attitudes and stereotypes and happens between people in a discrete moment. So between a therapist and a client in a session, someone makes a racist comment, erases somebody's gender identity. Or we also see this in, for example, decisions around what kind of diagnosis someone gets and what kind of diagnosis you make, who's placed on a psychiatric hold and who's not. So that's kind of the individual level that we see oppression manifesting itself in. But then there's also the institutional level, the things that are embedded in our structures, our policies, our systems. And so for our field, that might show up, for example, in the DSM. So we decide as a field whether or not there's a diagnosis for individuals with diverse sexual orientations or gender identities. So the inclusion of gender dysphoria in the DSM-5, for example, or historically the inclusion of homosexuality in the DSM-5 may be an example of institutional heterosexism or cissexism in our system. There's also an ideological oppression, which is this kind of consistent devaluing of groups of people that show up in our day-to-day norms, our language, our culture. So in our field, what that might look like is if we see folks prioritizing family or connectedness or the values of their community over themselves, we might start pathologizing based on our westernized context of mental health. We might start pathologizing that and instead seeing it as difficulties with attachment or not being agentic. And then the last process is internalized oppression, which is the process of learning all these messages that communicate inferiority that then get turned inward and incorporated in the self. So people who, ooh, about to sneeze, sorry. Excuse me. So people are all hearing these same messages that we as mental health practitioners are communicating and that culturally are being thrown around all the time. And so we might have people show up in session, for example, as a therapist, talking about how it's hard for them to be in spaces with other gay people, for example, someone I'm working with right now, because of all of the messages over time that this gay person has heard about what that means. So these are just really small examples of the ways that oppression kind of shows up at 4 different levels. And if you go to the next slide, and what can be really insidious about this is that at the same time this process or force is occurring against folks who hold certain identities. Folks who don't have that experiences, people who hold identities that are culturally valued, are also being privileged. So these are like 2 sides of the same coin, oppression and privilege. And like oppression, privilege is perpetuated over time, is both coming from historical influences and contemporary ones, and allows for the maintenance of power for one group over others. And privilege gives those of us with it access to resources, representation, and the ability to be seen as the norm around which things happen or are understood. And as a result of that, others are then even further seen as deviant or othered or wrong or exotic or whatever that kind of comparison ends up happening. And so something that makes privilege insidious is that because these things are unearned, because there's nothing about, for example, whiteness that makes that I do to get it or that makes me better, I get all of these things that come with it. It's unearned, and that because of that, it makes it hard to recognize. I'm not thinking about it all the time. I don't notice the ways in which the world is responding to me differently because I have it. It's just there. And so there's a lot of ways that privilege shows up culturally, legally, socially, institutionally. And so just to give some examples for people where this might be a newer idea, as a cisgender person, for example, I don't have to worry about whether or not I'll have access to healthcare that affirms my experiences or providers that know how to talk with me about my body, about my needs, about who I am, the language that I use. If I'm, as a white person, I feel safe walking down the streets and I don't worry if others are perceiving me as dangerous or as threatening. Or as an able-bodied person, I feel confident that I'll have transportation services as I need them that will accommodate me and where I need to go. So for most of us, we have parts of our experiences that are privileged and parts of our experiences that are oppressed. And those things all interact with each other. And one word that you'll hear often, or that you've already heard probably often in our kind of cultural our socio-political context right now is this idea of intersectionality. And this is this idea that all of our different privileged and oppressed experiences, all the different parts of ourselves are intersecting, meaning they all connect with one another. We have privileges in some areas, oppressed experiences in others, and those things uniquely influence how the world treats us. And one way to start thinking about that, Dr. Wynn, if you don't mind going to the next slide, is thinking about for yourself, what are the different aspects or parts of myself that organize how I walk through the world, and that systems then treat me differentially because of those things. And many of you may already be familiar with this framework. It's called the Addressing Framework by Pamela Hayes, and is a tool to kind of help you start thinking through what are these different areas of life where we really see power and discrimination coming through or affecting somebody's life. So it can be a really nice starting point for self-reflection and conceptualization of self, but also of the folks that you work with, the populations you serve or do research with. And you'll see here this includes things like age, disability status, religious identity, ethnic or racial identity, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, indigenous heritage, national origin, gender, and so much more that's not included on here. But it's a really great starting point. And I think to further build upon this, you know, I can talk about whiteness over here, and I can talk about being cisgender over here, and I can talk about being a queer person over here. But the reality is those different boxes that I might check off in a census survey don't actually encapsulate all of my experience or kind of the unique things that come together because of each of those identities. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a lawyer, kind of provided us this word, intersectionality, to help us understand what's happening there. And this is this idea that our identities aren't independent from one another. And because of that, systems of oppression uniquely impact all of us as individuals based on our intersections. And this can have a cumulative effect depending on who you are and how systems treat you, in that discrimination that you experience is kind of unexplainable and different from another form of discrimination. And this kind of multiplicative effect over time starts to infect your internal sense of self, the external material resources that you have access to, and your ability to participate and benefit from healthcare. And we'll talk in a minute about how then this uniquely impacts people's mental health and why we as mental health practitioners really need to be paying attention to this. So to get really concrete, because this can sound so heady, a simpler example of intersectionality is this idea around wage inequality. So we know that there's sexism in hiring practices, that women are treated differentially from men and end up being paid less. And in that same system where sexism exists, so does racism. And that means women of color are further differentially treated depending on their own racial identities, that then make that inequality further exasperated. And so then that pay differential is even further impacted. So we'll come back to this idea over and over again as we're talking more about microaggressions, stereotypes, and what we as mental health folks need to be doing in response to them.
So one of the common ways in which oppression shows up is through microaggressions. And understanding different ways in which one can engage in microaggressions and the impact of microaggressions on individuals' mental health is a really crucial step in practicing cultural humility. This is the step of self-awareness, self-reflection, and self-critique. The definition of microaggressions, they are subtle snubs, slights, and insults directed toward members of marginalized groups that implicitly communicate or engender hostility. There are three types of microaggressions. Microassaults, these are explicit derogations. Basically, these are old-fashioned racism. An example is calling someone Oriental or colored Microinvalidation is negating the experiential reality of a person. For instance, if a person of color addresses someone who may have made a microaggression, and the response may be, don't overreact, you know, I didn't mean anything by it, or being told you're being too sensitive. Another example is the phrase, all lives matter. Microassaults, this is demeaning of a person's heritage, identity. For instance, telling a person of color, the most qualified candidate should get the job, regardless of race. Or telling someone, wow, you are articulate, right? The first indicating that the person of color getting the job, you know, the reason that they got the job is because of their race rather than their qualifications. The second, while you are articulate, is assuming that because of their race or their backgrounds that they are not articulate, and that it is surprising that they are articulate. So none of us are exempt from holding biases, stereotypes, about and engaging in microaggressions against individuals. And this is because we live in a world in which we are inundated with stereotypes and biases in the media, in social interactions, in our education system. And so it's so easy to hold these stereotypes and act according to them. There are significant detrimental effects of microaggressions. Those who experience microaggressions are often caught in what we call a catch-22. You are damned if you do, and damned if you don't. The damned if you do alludes to the fact that if a person who have experienced a microaggression, if they confront or address the microaggression, confront the person who microaggressed against them, or even maybe share the microaggression with others, that oftentimes due to the subtle nature of the microaggression, that their experience are often invalidated. They may be told, you know, you're overreacting, they didn't mean anything by it, or I didn't mean anything by it. And so oftentimes these experiences can lead to secondary microaggressions, more invalidation. Damned if you don't. This indicates times where individuals may not address the microaggression and may feel guilt for not standing up for themselves, may feel guilt for not righting a wrong. And as you can see, being caught in this catch-22 can lead to a lot of stress, a lot of cognitive and emotional load that can lead to significant mental health impacts. And it can also impact access to equity. So I would like to show a YouTube video that really beautifully depict the detrimental effects of microaggression. Sasha, would you mind queuing up? Thank you.
Working on it. And I will apologize, everyone, if we do not get this to work. This is a work in progress. All right.
Hey everyone, welcome to Forward. We are a new kind of doctor's office that's doing primary care differently. For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem. Oh, you're so well spoken. Oh, just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite. Ugh, it's a compliment. Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while, no, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date.
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me? Going grocery shopping. You know, everything happens for a reason.
Just fine now.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the red skin name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner. I couldn't even tell you were gay. Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
John, you can be shopping is like, I live here too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty. Can
Can I touch it?
hair?
is fucking annoying. And it's listing on those mosquitoes. It seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares? Just another angry black one.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
It looked like he was up for trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
I'm going back to you.
Thank you. All right. So as you can see, that the detrimental effects of microaggressions is a cumulative effect over time that can lead to significant cognitive and emotional load. So I'm going to pass off the baton to Dr. Sauber.
And if it helps for people to have a theoretical framework to help kind of conceptualize or think through how over time microaggressions impact folks with identities that are oppressed, the minority stress model is a great place to start. This is very overly simplified, so if we have any folks in the audience who are really familiar with this model, you'll have to excuse me. But the idea here is that there's a couple of things that are happening that over time folks are having to hold that then affect their mental health outcomes. So the idea here is that in holding an identity or a status that's being marginalized, you're not only exposed to the daily stressors and general stressors of life that we all deal with, but you're also experiencing really specific processes and stress related to your the way that systems treat your identity. And some of that is maybe what is really clear to us, especially after going through those examples, things like experiences with discrimination, with stigma, with violence that happen at both individual and structural levels. And beyond that, there's also this kind of further internal or subjective experience of stress that depends on a person's individual histories and perceptions or appraisals of what's happening in those experiences of discrimination that then show up with further distress. And some examples of those things might be like concealment or disclosure around identity, if that's even an option for you, that brings on additional stress. There might be fear or worry about discrimination in the future that brings up further stress around safety, trust, protection. And then also that internalization process we talked about earlier. So internalizing these messages that then creates further stress in your life. And together, all of these things contribute to worsening mental health outcomes. And I think at the same time that all of this stuff is happening that can be so detrimental and unfair, there's also incredible resilience in most of these communities and with most people where in the face of all of these things happening, people thrive and survive and celebrate and persist. And this model kind of helps remind us of that too, because there's other things that can kind of protect someone from these experiences over time. And those things can be somebody's personal resources or their community or social or historical or ancestral resources. Also coping strategies that they've learned over time and their own relationship to their identities that can serve to protect or buffer from this stress. So we want to be kind of thinking about both what puts folks at risk, but also the ways in which people are protected or protect themselves over time from the cumulative impact of these microaggressions. And again, to bring back this idea of intersectionality, because we're all intersectional people and because these systems show up uniquely in our lives because of it, the way microaggressions show up will be unique depending on a person's social location. So there's some incredible researchers of color in the counseling psychology world that have done research to put academic language to what people have been saying for forever about how they uniquely experience these things. Excuse me. So for example, there's research highlighting how for some Asian American women, they have this unique experience at the intersection of their racial identity and their gender identity, of being fetishized or being assumed by others that they'll be submissive. Or for Black women, for example, there's research for some women, again, at that intersection of Blackness and womanhood, there's this kind of imposition of strength or imposition of anger on their experience. And these things can't be separated out between someone's racial identity or their gender identity. It's this unique thing that happens because of both that can't be separated. And the reason that this is so important is because we just want to hammer home the message that context always matters. And we want to be curious and wondering about how someone's own context is going to shift how these things show up differently in their lives, and then as a result impact their mental health differently. And not only is this happening in people's lives outside of mental health or outside of therapy, but they're happening in the therapy room too. So for example, when you ask racial and ethnic minority clients about their experiences in therapy, research shows microaggressions in those spaces are really common. So this is just one study from 2016 by Hook and colleagues. And in their study, 82% of their sample of over 2,000 clients reported experiencing at least one racial microaggression in counseling. And that's not accounting for all of their different parts of themselves or their identities that they're bringing forward. And so what Dr. Wen and I hope to talk about next is how we might use this idea of cultural humility and this model to help us approach what do we do when this starts to show up in the moment in our sessions or our work with clients, or for some of you maybe in your research or as you're thinking through what kinds of questions that you're asking about our field.
And so thanks, Lizzie. Now we're going to talk about clinical application, and we're going to bring back the cultural humility model to really highlight how both of us have approached diversity issues in the therapeutic space. And so I wanted to highlight the specific attributes of cultural humility before we move on. And this includes, again, being open, having self-awareness, engaging in self-reflection and critique, being egoless, and engaging in supportive interaction. And for the remainder of the talk, we'll share some case examples of how we have used or how cultural humility has guided our approach to addressing multicultural and diversity issues in therapy. So the first case example is one of my clients. This is a 40-year-old, second-generation Indian, able-bodied, single, heterosexual, cisgender male. He was a law student. His diagnoses included social anxiety and major depressive disorder. Our treatment focused on behavioral activation for his depression and exposure cognitive restructuring for his social anxiety. He presented with a lot of worries about people's perceptions and judgments of him, mistrust of others, negative core beliefs about himself and the world. He was completing law school and was on the job market, and he was also looking for housing. In terms of the presenting problems that he came with that is relevant for our talk today. So he came to session and noted that he had not received as many interviews as his classmates. And of the interviews that he did go to, he did not receive many callbacks. And this is someone who was at the top of his class, and he passed the bar exam with flying colors. Actually, he scored so high on the bar exam that he became a part of a very special group. He also feared that these outcomes were due to racial discrimination. His name was ethnically Indian. He was worried that his beard made him look intimidating. He was worried that his dark complexion may trigger anti-Muslim Arab sentiments. He's also been mistaken for those of Arab descent. He also shared that he had difficulties getting housing, even though there were plenty of places for rent on the market. And so in addressing this or these presenting problems, I used cultural humility to guide me. First, using the addressing framework in my case conceptualization of his issues and also in my self-reflection. And so the addressing framework helped me conceptualize his intersectionality of his identity that plays a role in his current experience of oppression. He had a lot of privileges. He was young, he was highly educated, middle class. He came from a family who had a lot of resources. He was cisgendered, and so he had a lot of strength and resources. On the other hand, he had, also experienced and had experienced throughout his life a lot of discrimination based on the way that he looked, the color of his skin, the shade of his skin, based on his name, his race, ethnicity, and all of these factors has culminated and actually is getting in the way of him realizing his dream, getting a job, getting in the way of his livelihood, getting housing. In terms of looking at the addressing framework for my self-reflection, I thought about how my own experiences of discrimination based on my race and gender has played out in my life. And it also helped me understand, and also anticipate my potential reactions to his own experiences and what's going to come up for both of us in the session. And after doing a lot of the using the addressing framework in this self-awareness, self-reflection phase, I was able to conceptualize his presenting problem and actually came up with a treatment plan of how to address this. So in the session, I focused a lot on supportive interaction and openness, starting out with validation of his experience, acknowledging that we do live in a world where oppression and systemic racism does exist. I provided the space and option to discuss his current experiences with racism that he's struggling with in the moment, as well as his past experiences of racism. And I also used strategic self-disclosure of my own experience to validate his experience. And using this strategy, I was very careful not to make this conversation about me and also take up all of the space. I was very careful not to do that. And what was helpful was doing the self-awareness using the addressing framework and anticipating my own emotional reaction to having this conversation. And so being very careful of not, basically taking all of the space with my own emotional reaction and my own experiences, and leaving room for him to explore his experiences. And so after focusing on the validation in this supportive interaction, we moved to coping strategies. One of the key attributes of cultural humility that that I want to highlight in using these change strategies is egoless. I really wanted to focus on the process of exploration rather than coming up with specific right answers. I wanted to be careful not to convey that there is a particular way, the right way to address these issues, and that to acknowledge that this is a difficult process and there are consequences, for whatever courses of actions that he would elect to take. So first, we discuss ways for him to cope with the symptoms that these experiences triggered. And this is the part where we were able to bring in a lot of the treatment strategies that we have focused on before. So emotion regulation, distress tolerance, cognitive restructuring, all of those strategies that, as psychologists, we're very familiar with. I also provided ways for him to navigate the racist reality and systems that he must face. And we had discussions of code switching. Basically, this is, being able to talk in a style that will be the most effective depending on the context that he's in. And this can include, not only switching the ways that he talks and present himself, but also thinking about his appearance and how he would like to change or not change his appearance based on the context that he's in. And in these particular situations, for interviews and for housing types of housing interviews, basically. I also validated the catch-22 of this current situation and highlighted the different options and courses of actions and their consequences. I think the really important part here is again highlighting that there's no right way, and that really exploring the different courses of actions and consequences and helping him identify his values and what these courses of actions either fit or do not fit with his values, and help him even when values conflict, identifying the priorities of his value. So through this process, what I learned from this process in working with this client is that there is, for me, a tendency or an urge to jump to problem solving. And I think for a lot of us, we are in this field because we want to help others and we want to take away their pain. When clients come in, we have all of these coping strategies that we want to give our clients so that we can take away their pain. And that was my urge when he came with these problems as well, is I have, specific strategies you can use. And through this process, what was really helpful, and this is what he reported that was really helpful, was the validation part. And I don't think that we would have made any headway in the coping strategies if we didn't start with the validation. He noted how just kind of a huge relief that he felt when we just first started to talk about his experience, and when I validated that yes, racism and oppression does exist, and it not only exists on the individual level but systemically. And he felt that was in a way a game changer for him to open up more. So it was very apparent to me that the validation part is crucial, and in a way more important than the change strategies that we ultimately went to. And And so that was what I learned from working with him. And you know, in working in treating clients, we often do this really nice dance between validation, acceptance, and change. And I think it is particularly important to do that balance, to do that dance when we're talking about racial or diversity-related issues in therapy, and especially if we take into account the cultural humility model. And he did get a job. And he ultimately also got housing. So that was the outcome. All right, I'm going to pass off to the second case example.
Sure. So for my case example, I thought I'd give an example of both what happens when you as a provider are the one perpetrating a microaggression, and then also how things get complicated when you are participating in or are part of systems that invalidate people or contribute to someone's experience of oppression. So in this context, I was working with a 55-year-old, able-bodied, partnered, non-binary, two-spirit person who is queer and biracial, both Native and white, and a Navy veteran. And they were seeking treatment for PTSD and generalized anxiety disorders in the context of a gender-specific residential program. And what that means is that the VA here, folks come in to get intensive treatment, and in our setting, to respond to the needs of women veterans' experiences, we have these programs, the Women's Trauma Recovery Program and the Men's Trauma Recovery Program. And this person was like, well, neither of these fit for me, and if I have to be somewhere, I'm gonna choose the Women's Trauma Recovery Program. So that's where they were and where I met them in treatment. And we were really focusing on, for them, building some emotion regulation skills, particularly related to anxiety that had kind of kept them out of work and out of kind of leaving their house or engaging with the communities that really mattered to them. And we were also focused on processing their military sexual trauma, their child sexual abuse, and using, you know, those behavioral strategies we know it can be really helpful for folks, specifically exposure and some cognitive restructuring around those experiences to help them get some distance from some of the symptoms that were bothering them most. And in the course of our work together, a small part of our work was talking about their queerness and their relationship to being two-spirited and Native and poly and kink, and they were really clear with me that while that's part of their life, that's not why they were here. They were here to work on their military sexual trauma and their childhood sexual abuse. And so while we had had some of these conversations, we hadn't been focusing on it. And when we were all in a community meeting, meaning like a group therapy setting, with myself, this veteran, and a bunch of other providers and veterans, I was reading off this kind of script and had defaulted into language that I use all the time. And I talked about the veterans in the program as all sisters. And in the moment, I saw the client that I was working with wince. And underneath their breath said, "We aren't all sisters." And I think for an additional context, in addition to having to already select the Women's Trauma Recovery Program, which was a really hard decision for them, they had been kind of consistently misgendered by both other providers in the program and by their fellow peers, their fellow veterans in the program who didn't consistently respect their pronouns or understand their gender identity. And so there was kind of a bunch of things to address here. So first is like the in the moment invalidation or erasure that I contributed in the milieu and in front of all of their peers who were already struggling to gender them. And what that actually meant for our therapeutic relationship and our ability to do trauma work together. And then there's also kind of system level wise, how to respond when you as a provider or me as a provider are participating in a system that's kind of reinforcing a binary that doesn't apply to this person by having these two distinct programs. And then also has myself and my colleagues are kind of continuing to erase them in our language and in the kind of the ways that we've been socialized to respond to gender in the day-to-day. And I think here, the both addressing framework and the cultural humility pieces were really important. So kind of on this first step of taking a step back and doing some self-reflection, I think for me, the biggest thing that came up at first was just a lot of guilt and shame. I'm somebody who does these talks all the time, and I'm in the queer community myself, and I'm in spaces with non-binary folks often, and I think there was something for me, I just felt really guilty and was like all up in my own feelings about what it meant that I was part of this, and really needed to take some time to really reflect on and work through my own feelings before working through it with the veteran who didn't need to hold all of that in our therapy relationship. I think the other things I was thinking about is how their non-binariness isn't just this kind of unique singular thing, but is influenced by their Native identity, and how there was so much that I didn't know about their relationship to the Indigenous community and what two-spiritedness specifically meant for them. As somebody who has such little knowledge and experience around Indigenous folks' experiences generally, and even more so around this specific part of their identity. And so it was a time for me to kind of take stock and figure out, well, what do I need to be really open and curious about with them to understand what this actually looks like in their life, but also what kind of learning do I need to be doing behind the scenes or in the future, so that I can be more open, more responsive, more supportive to folks I might work with in the future who are part of these communities. So in kind of shifting to the addressing part, there's a couple things. So first, I kind of had to start asking myself, and I think these are important questions for all of us to ask ourselves, like how do I first address this interaction that happened between the two of us where I heard them? And I think some questions to ask are like, well, if I respond, who's the audience? Like if I address this, will the person feel safer, or will they feel more targeted? Will they feel seen, or will they feel kind of even further othered? If I say something, will I regret not saying something? Will they regret that I didn't say something? If I respond, and like how long am I going to respond to it? Do I include the group, or is it just me and them? So a lot of really complicated questions that don't have clean answers. So I, in the moment, took my best guess about what would be most supportive for them based on our previous conversations, and chose to apologize, and then briefly corrected myself, and then shifted attention because they seemed uncomfortable and didn't want to further focus on it. And so this then later involved going back in our individual session, asking them if they would want to explore this further, and then after having consent, using that stance of openness and support to get really curious about what that was like for them, talk about it more together, and kind of collaborate to figure out what would that look like in the future if it happens either with us again or with other staff members and in their lives. And here is where I did a lot of listening, because this has been their experience for most of their life, and they really knew already what they needed. And I want to leave time here for questions because I see things popping up in the chat. So I'll just plug really quickly that a big part of this too was then figuring out, outside of my client, what's my responsibility as a psychologist to help educate my colleagues so that we're more inclusive, and continuing to struggle with our questions about what does it mean that we're in gender specific programs. And we haven't answered that yet. And I think that's really complicated for people here who also work in systems where it's really obvious how we're playing a role in this oppression. We don't have a clean answer yet. There's reasons we have that still, and there's also really big problems with that. And so we're still trying to work that out. For people who are wondering about specifics about, well, what do I say? What questions do I ask? How do I respond? I think we made a purposeful choice not to provide that here because as we were learning from the cultural humility model, it's not about doing it right. It's about learning, being honest and open. And if you're applying a script to somebody or a script to something that's happening, you might not be remembering that the folks you're working with or the systems you're working with are unique and have their own needs and can't be predicted based on their identities. And at the same time, holding a dialectic, we also know tools are useful, and sometimes people need a place to start for language. So we recommend these 3 really wonderful guides as places to start, all by psychologists, mostly psychologists of color and queer psychologists, based on other work from activists and artists and healers that are really useful in figuring out how you can start responding and what language to use. So with that, do we have some time for questions?
Yes, thank you so much, you guys. That was wonderful. Just get green. Thank you, doctors, and thank you for our participants. We will now take any questions. We did have a few come in. Let me just pull them up for you. Dr. Nguyen, we had a great question. Someone wanted you to get a bit more specific about how you talk to your client about code switching and whether or not to change his appearance without invalidating his identity.
Yeah, and that's a great question. And I think the building up with the validation really helped us be on the same page when I brought up code switching. And so by the time that I brought up code switching, we have talked about his experiences of racism, have validated the experiences of racism, and have talked about what people do, how he has coped in the past, because he has a lot of resources, and for him, he has engaged in code switching before. And so, so for me, just to name it, this is something that, you have been doing, and this is something that I could just basically put a name to it. And this is, switching how you talk or how you dress, in different contexts so that you can, get your objectives met. And, I can understand how it feels so, sometimes feels so invalidating that you even have to do that in the first place, right? That you have to, in a way, assimilate to the dominant culture, or acculturate to the dominant culture. And so just really validating the emotional toll that even the act of having to code switch can have on a person, and exploring, when you're engaging in code switching or changing the way that, so in specifically we talked about, should he shave his beard or not? This is part of his appearance, and because he thought that having a long beard that would trigger anti-Muslim, anti-Arab sentiments, and also make him look more threatening. And so we go back and forth about, should he shave his beard? And we talked about what's his value, right? On the one hand, this is something that is his way of expressing himself, right? And he really valued that. It also is, consistent with his self-esteem, right? He thinks that he looks good, in the way that he looks, and changing that may impact the way that he looks at himself. On the other hand, it may get him to his goal of getting a job, and he values independence, and he values being able to be financially secure. And so really weighing out these two values as we discuss this process of whether or not he would like to code switch in this context, and the consequences and the toll that it would take on him if he does decide to take one action or the other. So it's a lot of exploration and validation. Even as we are talking about these change techniques, we always bring back to validation of how hard this is, and what is consistent with his values in the moment.
Great, thank you so much. Any further questions can be emailed to webinars@adaa.org, and they will be sent to our presenters. We would like to invite you all to register for ADAA's next live webinar on December 3rd, Written Exposure Therapy, A Brief Treatment Approach to PTSD with Denise Sloan. Registration is also now open for the 2021 Anxiety and Depression Conference on March 18th through 19th, 2021. Admission includes access to all live sessions, live Q&As, posters and exhibits over the conference dates, and the opportunity to earn more than 50 CE or CME credits. If you are not yet an ADAA member, we invite you to view the many membership benefits that ADAA has to offer, including year-long access to great CE-eligible continuing education webinars, access to our special interest groups, and significant discounts on the annual conference. Thank you all so much for attending, and thank you to our wonderful presenters. Have a wonderful day.